Hello, you're watching World Talks on TVP World. My name is Sasha Farbach. Global oil markets are facing renewed turbulences as OPEC Plus pushes ahead with fresh output hikes, even as Ukraine's long-range strikes hit Russian energy infrastructure and reshape the supply map. Now, to analyze it all and what it means and how it can impact the wider markets, we're joined by Slawomir Raszewski, Senior Oil and Gas Lecturer, University of London. Good to have you back on TVP World.
Thank you for having me.
Slawomir, we have these numbers, 137,000 barrels per day increase in October. I mean, that's a significant number, but generally the first reaction, what does this mean directly right now for the markets?
So this change is going to be in place from October. So we don't have in instant, if you like, physical increase of output. But what we know from OPEC decision making is that there's a very strong, if you like, psychological impact. So we have to brace ourselves for more oil on the market. And indeed, the decision that was made yesterday is aimed at changing the, if you like, unwinding the plans that were earlier in place for, if you like, reducing the output. So we are heading towards more oil on the market in the midterm perspective, short to midterm perspective.
So more oil on the market, that sounds like prices will come down. There's one person in particular, I think it's President Donald Trump, I think, who will be a winner out of this. But tell us exactly, I mean, this also means lowering that price, more market share. So this is also a balance. So how is this going to, is this a bigger win for the US than it is for OPEC?
Well, I mean, OPEC is an organization that controls the prices. It controls the prices through the decisions that they make over the output. So how much oil can be delivered to the markets. So the world, broadly speaking, can be divided between those that produce oil, are net exporters, just like OPEC countries, and those that consume oil, which is pretty much the rest of the world. So I suppose that this is a good decision for those that consume oil. And of course, oil is the most traded commodity on the planet. We consume every day. The world consumes over 100 million barrels of oil. So indeed, this is probably a good news for the rest of the world that consumes the world, including the US. But we also have to remember that US is actually a major producer as well. Of course, not part of OPEC, but it is a major producer, and it's likely to have some impact on US as well.
Also, Russia is part of OPEC Plus. I mean, at the moment, their war economy relies on high prices of oil. Bringing that down doesn't seem to be in their interest. How much is this going to impact Russia in this way, do you think?
Well, you started by quoting the numbers, and I think that this is important to remember that, of course, the numbers are significant per day, 137,000 barrels of oil increase starting from October per day. But the question is, how much of that oil is going to actually be delivered to the market? I mean, depending who you're talking to, some analysts dispute that. They say, well, maybe we are witnessing 70, 80,000 de facto extra barrels of oil per day. So the question is this really going to significantly reduce the price of oil, which, as you rightly pointed, would not be in the interest of major producers, including Russia. But so I think that this decision should be largely seen as one of relevance. OPEC Plus, which means OPEC Plus those that opt in for quota mechanism, want to send a message to the world that oil is still there and oil is likely to remain important. I think this is probably the main decision. Is this going to have an impact on prices? Of course, but we also have to remember that prices of oil are determined both through major global, if you like, benchmarks and regional benchmarks. Russia mostly relies on regional trade and bilateral trade.
I want to focus on Russia another time in terms of also in recent weeks and months, really, there have been obviously a lot of strikes by Ukrainians on a lot of the oil infrastructure. In fact, if I'm looking back, maybe around August, certain refinery capacity in Russia knocked down, I think 17% of that. Surely this also must impact pricing. How vulnerable is that connected to the rest of OPEC? How does that impact decisions? And, let's say, look at prices for the barrel and, let's say, availability on the market.
Yes, I mean, the downstream markets is very much local, regional. So what we have witnessed, the unfortunate strikes of the infrastructure will definitely have impact on this particular region. But of course, OPEC decisions relate to upstream production, so production of crude oil. So this is, if you like, the high politics of international oil, whereas the refined markets, the downstream market is very much determined by the locations, where you live, who you depend on. And of course, in this part of Europe, the worries have been always about supplies from obvious destinations. So I think that this is probably going to continue to be an issue.
Talking also about the upstream, and we sometimes refer to OPEC as a cartel. I mean, in terms of decision-making power, I mean, I think it was 8 countries out of this whole organization that have increased, now are going to be increasing production. What about that decision-making process here? How does this work? I mean, Saudi Arabia, obviously one of the key ones. Do they buckle under pressure? This is more in their interests here. I think there would probably be it'd be interesting to be in that room when they decide this, but what was, in your mind, behind the decision, and who's really pushing the decision at OPEC and mostly here?
Okay, for the last 5 years, we have a transformation, or if you like to use the language of today, we have innovation within OPEC. OPEC has lost much of its relevance in the past, and it's decided to reinvent itself. It decided to innovate. That's why they've started working together with other non-OPEC members, large producers like Russia. So what we see here is really the relevance of the key producers. So we're back to square one, really. Who really is the largest producer of oil? Saudi Arabia is within OPEC. United Arab Emirates are within OPEC. And I think that after the departure of Angola in 2024, I think that there's more pressure on showing the muscle within OPEC that, their organization is still relevant and still there to play an important role, particularly in the times where energy transition is taking hold, most notably in the largest consuming nations like China. So I think that OPEC Plus wants to show that they are still in power to control the prices.
Mm-hmm. And on that question of power as well, into the competition, I mean, we have obviously still relatively small, but we have renewables, we have U.S. shale, we have Norwegian supplies. Where does OPEC Plus or OPEC in general see the greatest, let's say, threats to its influence? How is that going to impact pricing in the next few months?
Excellent points. You mentioned U.S. shale. I think that you have to be careful what you wish for if you're U.S., because obviously you don't want the prices to go too low, because that will have detrimental impact on the U.S. production capacity. In other words, too low prices of oil are likely to impact the production. Production will start cutting. But there's also one important thing you mentioned there, renewable energy. I think that this is particularly important in the context of the largest nations, like China, for instance. There's this new concept of electrostates versus petrostates. And if you like, what impact revolution that is taking place in China in terms of adding renewable energy sources, most notably hydro, but also solar and wind, is going to have in a long-term perspective. So I think that there is also the element of market share. The OPEC countries want to continue to be relevant through price control, but also controlling the market share.
All right, so many different factors, but we know for now that there's going to be more production. We'll see how that plays out in the market. It's always a very fluid field indeed. Look, always a pleasure. Thank you so much. That was our guest here this morning, Slawomir Raszewski. Appreciate the time.
Likewise, thank you.
And thank you for watching. That concludes World Talks here on TVP World, but much more coming up, so don't go away. Goodbye.